There's one part of The Lord of the Rings that seems to mystify readers more than any other part, and that is the Old Forest. They're chugging along, the tension is building, the ring wraiths are closing in on Frodo and the gang, and then suddenly they are waylaid in this mysterious forest with angry trees, and of course, Tom Bombadil himself frolicking through the wood. And let's just say there is a reason that they skipped over this incident in the movies. I've heard plenty of anecdotes from people who stopped reading The Lord of the Rings entirely because of how much the part in the Old Forest killed the story's momentum. However, upon a deeper look, I think there is a lot to be learned in the Old Forest. Not only is it essential to the overall story structure, but it epitomizes the very Tolkienian sort of magic that makes The Lord of the Rings so special. It had never been in the plan for the hobbits to pass through the Old Forest. They saw it as a breeding ground for danger and superstition. Rumors have spread about goblins and wolves, and even for those who don't believe these old wives' tales, they admit that there is something a bit odd about it. The forest is queer. Everything in it is much more alive, much more aware of what is going on, so to speak, than things are in the Shire. And the trees do not like strangers. They watch you. There are various queer things living deep in the forest and on the far side, said Mary. Or at least I have heard so, but I have never seen any of them. They only decide to risk the journey through the Old Forest because they have no other choice. The Black Riders are hot on their tails, and they need to strike out in an unexpected direction to throw them off the scent. With no other choice, they warily pass out of the Shire for the first time. As soon as they enter, the iron gate locks itself shut behind them, and the forest swallows them whole. They certainly aren't in Kansas anymore. Although the hobbits try to keep morale high, the forest seems to insist that they tread fearfully. The trees choke in too close. The air itself is heavy and dank. Despite the lack of undergrowth, they struggle up hills and across gullies, and their progress is painfully slow. They know, logically, that they're only surrounded by trees, but they can't help but feel that the trees are watching, glaring. Now, stronger than ever, they felt again the ill will of the wood pressing on them. So silent was it that the fall of their ponies' hoofs, rustling on dead leaves and occasionally stumbling on hidden roots, seemed to thud in their ears. Frodo tried to sing a song to encourage them, but his voice sank to a murmur. O wanderers in the shadowed land, despair not, for though dark they stand, all woods there be must end at last, and see the open sun go past. The setting sun, the rising sun, the day's end or the day's begun, for east or west all woods must fail. Fail. Even as he said the word, his voice faded into silence. The air seemed heavy, and the making of words wearisome. Just behind them, a large branch fell from an old overhanging tree with a crash into the path. The trees seemed to close in before them. They do not like all that about ending and failing, said Mary. I should not sing any more at present. Wait till we do get to the edge, and then we'll turn and give them a rousing chorus. Despite their attempts at levity, things only seem to be going further and further downhill. They're briefly able to get up high enough where they can see above the trees and see the path out, but as soon as they're back in the dark, they're lost. To their horror, the hobbits soon find themselves falling into step beside the fabled Withywindle River. They've heard that this is the most dangerous place where all of the dark creatures of the forest spring from. Still, it's better than wandering blindly, so they stick to it, the air becoming thicker with each step. The hobbits began to feel very hot. There were armies of flies of all kinds buzzing around their ears, and the afternoon sun was burning on their backs. At last, they came suddenly into a thin shade. Great gray branches reached across the path. Each step forward became more reluctant than the last. Sleepiness seemed to be creeping out of the ground and up their legs and falling softly out of the air upon their heads and eyes. The late summer sun lulls them off to sleep against their better judgment, and they drift off, leaning back against an old willow tree. When Sam wakes, still tired and disoriented, he finds himself alone. He panics, and eventually he finds Frodo, half submerged underwater, one of the great roots of the willow tree pinning him under. He rescues Frodo, only to find Merry and Pippin even worse off. Only Merry's legs are visible from a gap in the great knotted roots of the tree, and Pippin is gone entirely, nothing but a voice sounding from inside the tree. It seems that this forest might be a bit more lively than they bargained for. At first, Frodo and Sam try to set fire to the tree, but that only makes it worse. Merry is nearly squeezed in half as the great tree heaves in pain. They put out the fire in time, but then they're just watching as Merry is slowly consumed by the tree, just like Pippin. All seems lost until, over the hill, they hear a voice. It's a skipping, jaunty tune, complete with plenty of hey-doles and merry-doles and ring-a-dong-a-dillos, and as he comes into view, they see a man with yellow boots, a blue coat, and a long brown beard. He introduces himself as Tom Bombadil, and upon hearing about the hobbit's plight, he sets to fixing things. He speaks to Old Man Willow himself, saying, "You should not be waking. Eat earth, dig deep, drink water, go to sleep." Bombadil is talking. Merry and Pippin are spat free, and the bedraggled hobbits gratefully take the invitation to go to Tom Bombadil's house. There they find a cozy home and a table laden with beautifully rich foods, fresh butter, sun-ripened berries, and warm white bread. At the head of the table sits Goldberry, a gorgeous woman with long golden hair who Tom calls the River's Daughter. Since the first moment they entered the forest, it's all seemed rather like a dream. At first it was a nightmare, time and space slipping by in the dark folds of the trees, but here, in the house of Tom Bombadil, things are no less unreal. Tom feeds them, gives them beds to sleep on, and then the next day, as the rain washes the forest clean, he tells them its story. As they listened, the hobbits began to understand the lives of the forest apart from themselves. Indeed, to feel themselves as the strangers, where all other things were at home. Tom's words laid bare the hearts of the trees and their thoughts, which were often dark and strange and filled with a hatred of things that go free upon the earth, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning, destroyers and usurpers. It was not called the Old Forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods, and in it there lived yet, aging no quicker than the hills, the fathers of trees, remembering times when they were lords. The countless years had filled them with pride and rooted wisdom, and with malice. Through Tom, the hobbits begin to understand that the forest is a much more complicated place than they had originally thought. It wasn't simply a place, it was alive. Once, long ago, it had flourished, covering nearly the entire continent. But now it had been hacked, slashed, burned, and caged into this little corner of the world, and it was angry. This hostility was not an intrinsically evil quality. It was rooted in a pride that could only come with centuries of learning, of growing, of thriving. This pride is a survival mechanism, the last hope of a creature being choked to death by two-legged animals. Suffice it to say, here Tolkien was letting a bit of his personal bias slip through. The hobbits are a representation of the everyday British commoner, for better and for worse. This means that they excel at eating and drinking, and they're incredibly humble, but they're also very stubborn and hard-headed. They are probably the worst people in the world to try and plan a group vacation with. In their closed-minded little bubble of the world, the forest was nothing more than something to be used, something to facilitate the comfortable lives they had built for themselves. Tolkien saw firsthand the kind of harm that this thinking could do. He grew up in the early 1900s, just as the countryside of England was undergoing massive change. As a child, he had played outside, in the woods, in the valleys, admiring the ancient and varied ecosystem. But now, these centuries-old forests were being cut down, replaced with man-planted, even rows of non-native pine trees. To him, this was a sin on every level, historical, environmental, and cultural. This simmering rage is channeled into the forests that he built. In protest of a newspaper, which in an article had described a forest as having Tolkien gloom, he wrote, "In all my works, I take the pan of trees against all their enemies. Lothlorien is beautiful because there the trees were loved. Elsewhere, forests are represented as awakening to consciousness of themselves. The old forest was hostile to two-legged creatures because of the memory of many injuries." Tolkien dreamed of a world in which the forests had their own voice, in which they could threaten those who threatened them, in which they could swallow up the people that foolishly see them as nothing more than a place to take a nap. The old forest perfectly captures this rage, this anger simmering just under the surface. And yet, Tolkien did not see nature as an entirely hostile force. That was why he gave us Tom Bombadil as the opposite side of the coin of the old forest. While the trees are dark and grim, Tom is bright and welcoming, but no less unreal, no less primordial. He identifies himself, along with the forest, as eldest. Mark my words, my friends. Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the Barrow-wights. When the elves passed westward, Tom was here already, before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside. The message here seems clear. The Dark Lord came from the outside. Inside is where Tom Bombadil and his forest lie, untouched by the chaos and the churning of the world beyond. Because the ring, like Sauron himself, is from the outside, Tom is not affected by it at all. He takes it from Frodo, puts it on, does a magic trick with it, and hands it back to him, completely unaffected. Even Gandalf, who is practically a demigod, can't even touch it lest he risk temptation. But old Tom Bombadil is entirely unfazed, just like the forest itself. Here, Tolkien reveals to us the true power of his little tangent into the old forest. Although the ring is important, and the journey that they're embarking on is dangerous, there are things far more powerful and far older in the world. Sauron is old, but Tom and his forest are older. The Dark Lord's power is great, but it holds no sway over the pillars of creation themselves. Tom and his forest are not part of the world, they are above it, beyond it. And by dropping the hobbits into this place of neutrality, right as the story is beginning to ramp up, it reminds them of just how small they are in the grander scheme of the world. Frodo tests this when he gets the ring back from Tom. He puts it on just to make sure it's still working, and sure enough, the other hobbits marvel at his sudden disappearance. But old Tom Bombadil is not so easily tricked. "Hey there," cried Tom, glancing toward him with a most seeing look in his shining eyes. "Hey, come Frodo there, where be you a-going? Old Tom Bombadil's not as blind as that yet. Take off your golden ring. Your hand's more fair without it. Come back, leave your game and sit down beside me. We must talk a while more and think about the morning. Tom must teach the right road and keep your feet from wandering." Frodo laughed, trying to feel pleased, and taking off the ring, he came and sat down again. Tom now told them that he reckoned the sun would shine tomorrow, and it would be a glad morning, and setting out would be hopeful. The escapade into the Old Forest is, all at once, unnerving and encouraging. The simple worldview of the hobbits has been turned completely upside down, but they're able to leave the next morning a bit more hopeful. The section in the Old Forest is, I must admit, a bit superfluous. It's heavy with descriptions and has little to no impact on the actual plot itself. I totally understand why so many adaptations have cut it out. It didn't fit the kind of story that they were trying to tell. But when it comes to the kind of story that Tolkien was trying to tell, one shaped and beautifully formed by his intricate understanding of the cosmos, it is entirely necessary. The Old Forest, meandering, dreamlike, and strange, is Tolkien's way of reminding us that there are things far older, far more powerful, and far greater than we could ever know. I am so glad that I was able to come out into my own Old Forest to talk about this one with you guys. Let's pretend that the many location changes that happened throughout this video was for artistic reasons, and not because of logistical nightmares. Usually in my Places of Middle-earth videos, I've been trying to get into the behind the scenes from the movies, but since this part didn't make it into the movies, I figured I would just explore the forest as it is in the books. I feel like each of Tolkien's forests has kind of its own character, and right now, probably just because I wrote this video, the Old Forest is probably my favorite of those characters. But let me know in the comments which of the forests is your favorite. This video has been brought to you by my supporters on Patreon, without whom really fun videos like this one would not be possible. I am so absolutely incredibly grateful for all of the people that support me over on there. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like, because that really helps me out. And if you want to join me for the next video in this series, where we hop over to the city of Bree, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.